Where it is. It's not up there.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On what is now a lovely summer's day here at Bovington, we're going to put on a display for you now that'll last about half an hour, and hopefully by the end of the display you'll know a little bit more about what those different types of vehicles, mainly armoured vehicles, we've got here at Bovington. We'll tell you a little bit about them, what their role is on the battlefield, and we'll be telling you a bit as well about what the crews are up to inside the vehicles. But before we begin, the inevitable health and safety notices. First things first, we have water to track, try and keep the dust down, but just watch it as the vehicles go around. Some of them pump out a fair old bit of smoke, they can kick up some dust. Wind's a bit variable, it might come in your direction, so just watch your ice creams, your sandwiches, or the kids' eyes, whatever's out at the time. During the course of the display, there will be a number of very loud pyrotechnic bangs. Now, I warn you now, if you're of a particularly nervous disposition, this is probably not the show for you. So some very loud display. Now, we're going to start off, very first vehicle we're going to bring on for you, actually it's got nothing to do with armoured vehicles, but we just thought we'd bring out a vehicle, show you some of the other things we've got here, because from the Tank Museum's point of view, we tell the story of armoured warfare, but of course you need lots of other types of vehicle to support tanks when they go forward into action. Logistics vehicles, in other words supply vehicles, vehicles to bring food, petrol to keep the engines going, food for the troops, ammunition to keep the guns working, all of those types of things. And also you need vehicles to whip around taking people, what they sometimes call liaison roles, and the Jeep is a perfect example of that vehicle from the Second World War. Now, America, who designed and built the Jeep in World War II, before the Second World War, we think of America now, massive, great, big superpower, big army, 20s and 30s, they had a tiny army. Their policy was, if a war came, we're going to throw money at the problem. And that's exactly what they did. In 1941, they were attacked at Pearl Harbor. In the 30s, though, they'd been doing some experimental work on some armoured vehicles. They made about 2 tanks a year. They made experiments with the automotive industry, and when the war came along, they went to a company called Bantam and said, we're going to need a very small off-road vehicle, 4-wheel drive. In other words, all the wheels are powered by the engine to get it around the place, and it needs to be able to carry a load of about 1/4 of a tonne. So when you see all these descriptions of vehicles, quite often it's not the weight of the vehicle they're telling you about. If it says something like 1/4 tonne vehicle, it's the actual amount it can carry in the back. And Bantam came up very quickly with a design. The American Ford company, Willys, come into it as well. They put it into production, and where the Americans work in World War II is they use their motor car industry, which is a Henry Ford process, mass production. In other words, you don't make things one at a time, you put them on a conveyor belt and you make vast numbers. And one of the points we try and make here at the Tank Museum is you can have the best tank in the world, but if you don't have enough of them, that's no good to anyone. You need a lot of things in wartime, and the Americans made 500,000, 500,000 of these Jeeps. And if we compare that, we always try and compare contrast. If you look at what the Germans built in World War II, they did a little vehicle called a Kugelwagen. Throughout the entire war, they made 50,000. So you start getting an idea of the comparisons of numbers. Now the Jeep, very useful vehicle for so many different roles, came out, ended up being used by just about every armed forces for every different reason in World War II. Great little off-road vehicle, easy to maintain and work on. And after the war, they carried on in service around the world. This particular Jeep was actually made in France after the war by the Hotchkiss company. And if you're thinking of buying yourself a Jeep out there in the audience, in the old days I used to sneer at the French ones because they weren't wartime. Nowadays, everybody likes them because they're actually built to a higher build standard than the wartime's one. So the things like the metal on them, it's slightly thicker gauge than the wartime Jeeps, which means it will go on a bit longer. So there's one of those vehicles that you'll see in just about every photograph somewhere in the picture. In World War II, there'll be a Jeep there. This is a vehicle you don't see so much of. This is quite a rare vehicle. This is called a Morris armoured car. Now again, if you've all watched your Dunkirk movie, Britain lost most of its equipment in France in 1940. We were able to rescue the army off the beaches of Dunkirk. They were saved to be able to fight another day, but they just didn't have the equipment. That had been left behind. So in the summer of 1940, Britain went through an emergency crash program of trying to create new vehicles quickly. Now they actually made a vehicle called a Beaverette. They got a standard family car and put oak planks on the front. That was going to stop the Panzers if they crossed the channel. They Mark II Beaverette, we ended up with a bit of armour plate on it as well as some oak planks. And it was that desperate in the summer of 1940. They went to Lord Nuffield, who ran the Morris Motor Car Company. He got his Morris standard car and they put armour plate over the top of it. And the first model of this vehicle, the Morris armoured car, was produced very, very quickly. It kind of looks it in a weird way. It's got a bit of a higgledy-piggledy look about it. Bit of armour plate to stop a bullet. Machine gun in a mini turret. Driver sits right in the middle at the front of the vehicle. It's a really awkward thing to drive. 2 other crew members they'd squeeze in there as well. And this is actually the improved model, the Mark II. And this one you can actually select 4-wheel drive. But it was something rather than nothing. Even though the soldiers quite often knew it wasn't a brilliant vehicle, it meant we got something in the front line if the Germans had crossed the channel. Now the amazing thing with this vehicle, it actually ended up serving throughout the rest of the war, even though it was really only an emergency measure vehicle, and these soldiered on right the way to 1945. Some were used by something called the RAF Regiment to defend airfields, others were used by engineers, field reconnaissance, all sorts of things ended up using this vehicle. So even though it was a bit of a bodge at the beginning of the war, it ends up going on and serving throughout the whole war. And what you've got with that vehicle, the idea of it was scouting and reconnaissance. Find out where the enemy are, report back with your radio. This would take something called a 19 set, radio the information back in. Now you're at Bovington, so there'll be vehicles training going around the roads all the time. We'll talk about those a bit later on. Now another one of those classic looking vehicles from the Second World War. This is an American half-track vehicle. I mentioned earlier the Americans had been doing experiments, hadn't made many vehicles, but they were doing experiments in the 20s and 30s. And what they've done with this vehicle, they made a little 4-wheel drive vehicle called a White Scout car. Same front on it, and basically what they did, very sensibly, they chopped the front of that Scout car off, stuck a longer body on the back with tracks on, glued the 2 things together as it were, and they made the half-track. This particular version of it is called an M16, and again, you know, there's all these little numbers of things. M normally means model, and then they give a number, the type of half-track it is, and the M16 version has this 4 whopping great big .50 caliber machine guns in the back. .50, it's the size of the bullet, half-an-inch bullet it fires out the end. Now, the idea of the half-track, the Americans think you're going to need to be able to take the soldiers forward into battle under some sort of protection. If you've got tanks, World War I, the tanks are being used almost like battering rams. The soldiers walked on behind them as they crushed down the wire. You can see that first tank in our diorama, the Mark I, in the side of the museum. Soldiers walked on behind, following in its wake. The top speed of that first tank, about 3 miles an hour with the wind behind you. didn't need to go any faster because it didn't want to lose the soldiers following on. Now, the Second World War, the tanks are doing many more things on the battlefield, and they're doing them much faster. So these vehicles are now needed to keep the soldiers up with the advance. And this was another one of those vehicles that the Americans made over 50,000 of, lots of them made, and they also made them in lots of different configurations. So some for soldiers in the back, some were ambulances, some were made for as repair workshops. This one, this M16, originally it's designed with those 4 machine guns on something called a Maxim mount. It's powered, it's to take down any low-flying German aeroplanes that are approaching. So it could go with the tanks or the infantry or the trucks, and it'll protect them. Now, after D-Day, pretty much most of the German Luftwaffe, their air forces, already knocked out the sky by our much more powerful air forces. So these found they hadn't got much to do, but they kept them with the troops because they found actually firing 450 caliber Browning machine guns at a ground target is really useful. And I mentioned earlier, this .50 caliber bullet, it's a big bullet, fired it at your car, it'll go through the engine block, straight through, all the way out the back. It's a very powerful machine gun. So they charmingly called this weapon in the ground mount role a meat chopper. You certainly didn't want to be in the way of this when it's firing at ground targets. And if you look at the sides, you can flop down the sides, the top of the armour in the back, and that means it can spin round and fire level to the ground. So it was still used right the way up to the end of the war. And again, lots of these American vehicles were then passed on to armies all around the world afterwards as they were rebuilding, mainly in Europe, of course, but many countries had these in service well into the 1980s. Now, I think we can all agree this one now looks like a proper tank should look like. And this tank coming on, this is a British tank from the end of the Second World War. This is called the Comet. And I'll just let you listen to the lovely engine sound. Now, if you look inside the museum, you can see the tanks the British Army had at the beginning of the war, and I've already mentioned the fact we lost quite a few of them out in France in 1940. We concentrated in Britain in 1940 onwards to build aeroplanes like Spitfires and Hurricanes to defend ourselves, and then bombers to get back at Germany. Tanks and armoured vehicles took us second place for a while, and we were really lucky because when America comes in the war, they start producing armoured vehicles in such huge quantities they can supply them not just for their own forces, but they supply them to Britain, Canada, even to Russia. The famous Sherman tank, again, you can see inside. Our own tank development stalled a bit in the middle years of the war. But when we got going again, it's a bit of a myth to always think the Germans had the best tanks. This was an absolutely cracking tank when it went into service late in 44, early in 45. So what have we got here? When you look at a tank, you've got to remember really the key ingredient is the gun. That's what it's all based around. And by this stage of the war, we developed, first of all, a gun called the 17-pounder. That was the weight of shot it fired. We then changed over to measuring them by the size of the hole at the end of the barrel. So this one we call a 77mm gun. That's the size of the hole at the end of the barrel. And it's a development really of the 17-pounder gun, and this gun was more powerful than the gun on the famous Panther tank. And by this stage of the war, when it's firing at another tank, it doesn't fire a bullet-shaped round that you're used to seeing coming out of a rifle or a pistol. It's firing a pot out the end of the barrel. When that pot leaves the end of the barrel, it's going almost at supersonic speed. The sides fall away and it leaves a slug of tungsten metal shooting towards the enemy tank with an enormous amount of kinetic energy behind it. And it's that kinetic energy, in other words, a sheer welly behind that piece of metal that does the damage. There's no explosive on it at all. It just smashes its way through the enemy tank and causes one hell of a mess inside the vehicle. And that gun was very, very accurate. And again, a well-trained crew in this sort of thing, you'd hit a target 2.5 kilometers away, really, you know, very easily. And that, when you think earlier in the war, 1 round over, 1 round under, you were lucky if the 3rd round's on target. This thing, if you're in range, pointing at you, you're a goner in an enemy tank. Now, to crew the vehicle, in the turret, there's 3 guys. Commander, he's the one higher up, looking out for targets, telling the driver who's down the front where to go. On the other side from the commander is the loader, who's picking up those big rounds to whack into the breech of the gun. Top tip of the day, if you ever have to pick your own tank crew, pick a loader who is short, stocky, built like a Russian shot putter, because rate of fire of this tank will go down as he gets worn out. So you need someone with plenty of stamina. And the actual guy who fires the gun is in the front of the turret. He's got a telescopic sight and a foot pedal that he stamps on when he's ready to fire the gun. Right in the front of the tank, there's 2 more crew members. Driver has a tiller system to steer it. The idea is if you pull back on one of the tillers, brakes the track on one side, the other side of the track keeps going and it pushes you round the corner. So if you pull back on the right tiller, brakes the right hand side, you turn right. Pull back on the left tiller, you turn left. Pull back on both tillers, you come to a dead halt. And on the other side at the front, there's a bow machine gunner, but he also operates the radio. But the fact the tank has machine guns as well, don't forget, tanks aren't always fighting other tanks. Most tanks get knocked out in World War II, not by another tank, but by anti-tank guns. So a lot of the time you'll be fighting, but not necessarily fighting other tanks all the time. That's another one of those myths. We always like just comparing tanks as if it's top trumps. Actually, quite often a tank that might not be the best in the world in terms of its statistics might still be really useful on the battlefield. So the Comet, you can hear, I mentioned about that lovely rumbly noise of the engine. What we finally got with the Comet as well is a really powerful engine to speed this tank around the battlefield. They actually had to put a limiter on it to stop the driver going too fast and shaking the tank apart. They limit it to 32 miles an hour. It can go well over 40 if it didn't have that limiter on it. And that's because we put the engine out of the Spitfire, the famous Meteor engine, derated it, put it in the back of a tank, and they call it a Meteor. So it's the original Merlin, now called a Meteor. So it was really powerful petrol engine and really gave that tank a hell of a lot of welly. Now the Comet saw service at the end of the Second World War, and it went on British service to 1958. Other armies, it was passed on, so other armies used it. Burma had still had it in service well into the 1980s. Also a good example there, tracks, by the way, tracks are there like you're taking your own road with you. So the whole idea of a track vehicle, you lay down your own roadway in front of you, that's the track. You bite into it with a toothed wheel, and that's on the back of the Comet tank. They're the only wheels powered by the engine, the wheels with the teeth on. And they bite into the track and they pull the vehicle along it. The wheels resting on the track on the ground are not powered at all. They're just spreading the weight out of that big heavy vehicle over the ground so it doesn't sink into the ground. Wheel on the front, called the idler wheel, is just keeping it nice and tight so the track doesn't flop off. So lay down your own roadway in front of you, bite into it, pull yourself along it, pick it up and throw it forward again. That's what you're doing with tracks. So again, second top tip, if you want to knock out a track vehicle and you can't penetrate the armour, blowing up or breaking a track is a really sensible thing to do. The army call that a mobility kill, and it means the vehicle will just go round in a circle. It won't be able to go anywhere. So that's another effective. That's why they use mines to try and blow up tracks. So, lovely lineup there of Second World War Allied vehicles. You've just seen we brought on a couple of our volunteer infantry. We're going to see those in action in a little while's time. Before we parade them off, I've been wittering on at you now for about 20 minutes, so you're falling asleep in the sunshine. I'm telling you what I think you ought to know. So I know we've got Tom out in the audience. There he is. Right. He's asked a few people questions of what they'd like to know. So Tom, over to you.
Hi David, I'm here with Oscar from Ferndam. And Oscar, do you want to ask David?
What is the biggest tank in the world?
Did you hear that, David?
The biggest tank in the world?
Yes.
In the old days, it was the Germans built a tank, and they were actually just starting to produce them before the factories got bombed. They produced one called Mouse, bit of a joke, Mouse, but they made one, and that was over 100 tons, and they were actually just starting to make those. Nowadays, the British Army's Challenger 2, they don't like admitting its exact weight, but it's well over, it's nearly 80 tons with all the bits bolted on the outside. So imagine that, if you've got a big car, it's normally about 2.5 tons. So you're looking at most modern tanks, well, some of the bigger modern tanks, about 70, 80 tons, that sort of range.
I'm here with Harry, who is Oscar's brother. Harry, what do you want to ask David?
What was the first ever tank built?
What's the first ever tank? We've got it here. I hope you've all seen it inside the museum. Little Willie. Pretty much every country's got its own version of what they thought they wanted to build. There's some very clever ideas. Little Willie is the first time something really gets built, and that's built way back in September of 1916. Well, sorry, it's 15. It actually is trialled for the first time. They don't put it into production, but they learn lots of lessons from it to make the Mark I tank. But yeah, go and have a look at that inside. It's on a turntable.
One more quickly.
One more, far away.
Yeah, I'm here with Liam from Bristol. Liam, what do you want to ask David?
Where do they store the food in the tank?
I missed that. You want to repeat it?
Where do they store the food in the tank?
Where do we store the food in a tank? Good question. Sometimes they have rations that are in tins or boil in the bag meals, but all British tanks since the Second World War have something called a BV, boiling vessel. It looks like a square kettle, and in it they can put hot water, and the whole point is you can make a cup of tea really quickly inside the tank, or put your food, boil in the bag in there, and it heats it up so you can eat it quickly. It was such a popular item in the first Gulf War. The Americans got really envious because they saw the British soldiers coming out their tanks with already with a hot cup of tea. So the Americans bought that boiling vessel, as it's called, from the British company, and now all the American Abrams tanks have a tea maker, as it were. They probably make it for coffee in their tanks as well. Really important, food and hot drinks to keep the morale up. In World War II, another one of these little amazing facts, on the first day of the war in World War II, Britain bought the entire stock of the world's tea, so that we knew it was going to be important for morale. So that's how important food is. Right, we're moving the vehicles off. You can see them parading off there. We'll see them again in a moment. You can hear that lovely Comet engine, petrol engine in the back. Most tanks now are actually powered by diesel engines. There's a very good reason there. Well, two very good reasons. One is safety. Diesel is harder to set on fire than petrol, and that means the guys inside, if they're hit, have a few more seconds to get out. And the second obvious reason, if you've only got, now the British Army have a one fuel policy, if you've only got diesel engines, you've never got the chance of doing what sometimes happens with a family car, putting diesel in a petrol engine or petrol in a diesel. You know the arguments that causes. Imagine that on the battlefield. If you did that at night and ruining an engine, your commander is not going to be happy with you. So most vehicles in the army, certainly in the British Army now, they're all diesel. So, a little bit of imagination is needed now. What we've got to do now is start thinking Normandy 1944. There's an Allied force, we've just seen them. We've got a scout vehicle, we've got a half-track vehicle that can carry infantry, we've got a Jeep that can carry infantry as well. We've got a Comet tank there, they're not really there in Normandy, but let's pretend a bit. We're going to put those together for you now. Now, First things first, you all on holiday? I'm boring, but I'm not that boring. Can we try that again, please? Are you all on holiday? Yeah. Good, right. Pay attention and join in then. If you see the Germans coming this way to capture that very important mound behind me, where you can see that bit of corrugated tin there and everything, I want you to start yelling, okay? And I mean big kids as well as little kids. The Germans are the baddies, right, in World War II. So if you see their tank coming in this direction, I want to know about it, okay? And I blew well hope it starts today. Right. Now the Germans, really clever with their tanks in World War II. They even make tanks without turrets on because they're cheaper and quicker to make. Where are they? Come on, you must have seen one panto. Right, here comes the Germans. Right, now that tank they've got there, they call it something called an assault gun, or the Germans they call it a Sturmgeschütz. And it's a really clever way. Instead of making a tank with a turret on that costs lots more money because all the engineering needed, they made tanks with the guns stuck in the front of the hull. And that was great for defence. You knew where the enemy was coming from. It's got a few degrees turning up and down, left and right, and hiding it behind there, ready almost in a bit of a trap. Now, let's see if we were paying attention earlier on. Let's imagine an armoured force commander's got to come and capture this position back off the Germans. What's the first thing he's going to want to do or need to do in a situation like this? Go on, yell it out. What's he going to want to do? Make a cup of tea? Come on, we're talking about the army, not the RAF. What would the army need to do? Right. Someone's got it. Right, they'd send out their reconnaissance vehicle or their scout vehicle, wouldn't they? Because they need to know where the Germans are, first of all, what strength they're in, what's the best way of getting at them. Because again, if you're going to use your tanks, you can hear a tank coming from miles off, that noise, but you taught how to hide it in the landscape. Really important, keep hidden from the enemy. There's all sorts of things you can do. Call in artillery fire onto the enemy's position. You can do all that just by using your radio. There's a comment that the best weapon on a reconnaissance vehicle is its radio. That's the important thing. You find out, will the bridges take the weight of your big heavy tanks coming up behind? But the important thing is reports all that back to the force commander before the attack. The army has a phrase, time spent on reconnaissance is rarely wasted. Now, here comes then our attack force. So we've got our tank, that's the Comet, with a big anti-tank gun on the top of it, high-powered gun there, followed by the half-track vehicle with the 50 caliber machine guns in the back. Whoa. Germans putting down fire, they can see this attack force coming at them. And there's even our Jeep at the back there to carry a couple of our volunteer infantry as well. So the Comets lining up on the German position there. Well, looks like we may have a hit there on the German Sturmgeschütz. Now the Comet there, that's always the one with the firepower. And the other thing with tanks, they always have the thickest armour on the front. So they try and face towards where the enemy are most of the time, so they've got the best protection. It's also a good idea when a tank stops anywhere, you know it's pointing towards the enemy, because that's where they try and protect themselves. Now the Comet looks like it's working its way around the flank, around the side of the German position, whilst there's our infantry debussing, and the whole idea here is the infantry are going to put in a section attack. We've only got 3 infantry, and that infantry coming forward, one section at a time, dropping down, and then the other section comes forward and drops down as well. And the whole idea of trying to keep in a straight line, by the way, one section is firing, covering the other enemy, and then the other section moves forward. And the whole point there again is so you don't run in front of your mate and get shot up the backside. Oh, we got a stoic lot today. They're charging the Germans. Oh, look at that, pathetic. Germans are thrown in the towel already there. Well done, our volunteers, even if we only had 2. Well done there today. Give them a round of applause. They've done very well doing that. And there we go, there's the Union flag going up so we can all sleep safely in our beds tonight. Well done. Now, actually, it takes you about 6 weeks in phase 1 infantry training before they do a section of cat tac. So the 2 brave souls who volunteered there actually have done very well to pick up all that just before a display. What we're going to do for you now, ladies and gentlemen, Rurik, the Germans, will be taken into custody, don't worry about them. We're going to start our rides vehicle in about 10 minutes' time. That'll be running till about 4:30 this afternoon from down the corner there. We'll be opening our vehicle conservation centre, and the vehicles that we're going to parade off now are going to park up so you can have a look at them over in front of the vehicle conservation centre. Just remember, some of the exhausts are going to be hot. And the other thing to remember is your ticket, it's not just for today, your ticket is a whole year's membership of the Tank Museum. There's a few special event days you can't use the ticket on. If you've got any doubts, have a look on the website, but please do make the most of that. You can bring that same number of people back with you next time you visit. And if you are on holiday, I do hope the weather stays good for you and you have a lovely time down here in Dorset. Thank you.